Hi, welcome back to the Russian History Podcast. This is episode 114, the first Azov campaign. Okay, thanks again for joining me. Last week we got into the army mutiny of 1682 and how entire elements of the army were, for a period of time, able to barricade themselves and the royal family into the Kremlin before finally being paid off, and then the ringleaders of the mutiny were later hunted down and executed on Sophia's orders. This week it's time to look at Peter's rule in his own right. Ivan, Peter's elder, mentally infirm half-brother, would actually cede full rule to Peter before his own death. Thus, rather than waiting for Ivan to die, Peter would become sole Tsar in 1689. Had Sophia not tried to take power for herself, it's unlikely that this could have happened. However, as a result of losing her base of power and support in her attempts to take the throne for herself and Ivan, she's also removed Ivan's power and support, most notably from within the army. Whether Peter influenced Ivan's decisions to give up his responsibilities is a matter of debate, but in all likelihood, Ivan was, somehow, coerced or convinced that the position of Tsar was not for him. With the removal of Sophia, it's unlikely that Ivan had any input or influence over policy or events anyhow. On taking power for himself, Peter would begin to look at, again, how he could modernise Russia's military, and deduced that the next element that needed to be improved was Russia's navy. The navy, when talking of 1689 at least, probably isn't quite what you imagine. Yes, earlier in the 17th century, Russia had wielded some sailing ships, most notably the three-masted ship the Frederick, which sank the same year it was commissioned, but the navy Peter has inherited is very much a river fleet. Therefore, cast aside those images of high-masted sails, Russia isn't quite at that stage as yet, and think more river barges with banks of rowers, something more akin to antiquity than the late 17th century. Peter realised that the rivers of Russia offered something of a logistical advantage, in that they could be used to supply and ferry troops around its now vast lands, and decided that, at this point, not only the ships themselves, but also those manning them, needed to be upgraded. At this point, the crews of these ships, particularly the rowers, were either petty criminals who had been sentenced to hard labour, or, less commonly, captured prisoners of war. Morale was, obviously, non-existent. These were people that had no interest in being aboard these boats and, in all likelihood, prior to being used for rowing, and no knowledge or experience of working on a ship. Life, as you'd expect for these rowers, was absolutely brutal. Rations were meagre, disease was rampant, and many needed the extra motivation of the whip to make them actually row. Thus, its reliability, effectiveness, and efficiency were much like the morale amongst the men, non-existent. With this in mind, and realising how important this fleet of brown water vessels would be, in that the army would almost entirely depend on them for their operation, Peter did away with the forced labour. Instead, just as in the army, people could now volunteer, be paid for their service, and have the possibility of rank and promotion. Now, these reforms of Peter might sound lofty, modern, and liberal, but let's not confuse things. Not to get ahead of ourselves, and it is something we'll cover in due course, but don't be of the mistaken belief that Peter's reforms are being instigated to better the lives of anyone within the state, least of all the common man. Instead, these reforms are all about improving the administration and productivity of the state, And when we get to the domestic reforms the next couple of weeks, you'll see that they are anything but liberal or enlightened. So these river-going fleets, what is it that Peter has seen about them that requires such a large expenditure? After all, he's replacing free labour with professional services that will cost a small fortune to run each year. Well, Peter realises, or more likely has been advised, that for how good his army is drilled and trained, they can only campaign and wage war as well as they're supplied. This river fleet is going to be the backbone of his logistics train, allowing his army to campaign into regions that would have proved nigh on impossible to supply into previously. Whilst Peter was pushing this particular reform through, events in Europe were tumultuous to say the least. The Holy Roman Empire, with their now Venetian, Polish and Papal allies, amongst others, as the Holy League, were waging a great war against the Ottomans and achieving significant successes. As a result, Peter wanted to exploit this period of Ottoman reverses and launch his own campaign to exploit them. The Great Turkish War, as it was known, had been raging since 1683, and come 1686, Sophia had actually already brought Russia into the conflict with little action or success to show for it. Again, the reason for this lack of success was due to Russia's inability to field a large campaigning army on the Ottoman frontier, something that Peter's naval reforms are looking to rectify, allowing the state to actually participate in the war in a meaningful way and contribute to the League's success and then profit from them from the eventual peace treaties. Prior to Russia's proper entry into the war, with Russian contributions being minimal, initially at least, the Holy League had seen success after success with only the odd reverse. Much of Hungary, including Buda, that part of what is now Budapest that lies on the west bank of the Danube, had been liberated. Transylvania had come under Austrian control, Serbia and Belgrade were under threat. There was the real possibility that not only the entirety of the Balkans would be liberated from Ottoman overlordship, but that even Constantinople itself might come under threat, which would surely bring the war to an end. Still, Peter did not rush into anything when he became sole Tsar. Rather than attempt to attack the Ottomans, he and his generals would plan and finish their reforms of the army and the navy. Prior to becoming Tsar in his own right, internal discontent had prevented Russia from offering any support in the way of an offensive, even if they had wanted to. It would take until 1695 until Peter was ready to launch Russia's first major offensive, and the Azov region to the east of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov would be Peter's primary target. Having been under some form of Ottoman rule since the late 15th century, this was a particularly challenging target, but, if successful, would open up Russia's access to the Black Sea and the Caucasus region. In the winter and spring of 1695, the great transport ships that Peter had built, along with their now professional and motivated crews, were transported to the River Don, all tasked with delivering troops, ammunition, guns and food for a lengthy campaign in the region. Some 30,000 men in 3 army groups would be deployed in the area, whilst a separate army group were deployed on the Dnieper to guard against any Ottoman incursions into central Ukraine. By July, Ottoman forces around Azov had been swept aside, and the fortress was put to siege. Opposing them was around 7,000 Ottoman defenders, and although under siege, the Ottomans still controlled the coast and the rivers, preventing this garrison from being starved out. Despite the disparity in numbers, the fortifications of Azov were formidable enough to make up for the difference in numbers. With this in mind, Gordon, the Scottish-Russian general in charge of the campaign who we've spoken of previously, and was one of Peter's greatest friends and supporters within the military, would attempt to storm the fortress on the 1st of August. However, this assault would be thrown back with casualties of almost 2,000 men. Although the fortress itself was not taken, two minor fortifications that overlooked the river were. On the 25th of September, a second assault would be launched. Now, this second assault did enjoy some success. The walls of the fortress were taken. However, a determined Ottoman counterattack were able to repulse the attackers, and the Russian troops had to retreat back to their own lines, again suffering heavy losses. With winter approaching and the risk of the Russian supply lines faltering due to swollen or even frozen rivers, the order was given to retreat. 3,000 men would remain, manning the two minor fortifications that had been taken in the initial assault. This might have been a Russian defeat, in that the campaign had to be paused for the winter, but it was by no means an end to Peter's objectives. He may well have been able to maintain the siege throughout the winter, even perhaps bringing the campaign to an end. But prudently, he recognised that his army would be better placed being withdrawn to areas that could be better supplied. Rather than subject his troops to a brutal siege, where the besiegers would have likely have suffered just as much as those being besieged, his intention was to withdraw, regroup, replan, and try again next year. Importantly, Peter and his general staff would learn the lessons of the first campaign's mistakes. Yes, his river fleet has been reformed, but these reforms would need to go even further to enable the army's success. Next week, we'll be covering the renewed Russian offensive against Azov as Peter, again, attempts to wrestle control of the fortress away from the Ottomans and open up the possibility of expansion to Russia's south. Thanks again for joining me. As always, look for us on Twitter at RuhirPodcast or by searching for the Russian History Podcast. Emails with questions and queries can be sent to the Russian History Podcast at gmail.com. A special shout out to Kim V, who amazingly has been a patron for some 16 months now. Thank you, Kim, you're the reason that we're still here. As always, you can support the show by leaving a review on iTunes or by making a donation on Patreon, just as Kim has done. Both are a huge help to bring new people into the fold or to help with the expenses of running the podcast, and many thanks to each and every one of you that have left reviews or already joined on Patreon. Thanks again. Ta-ra for now.